I'm so happy to be here to get the chance to talk to all of you, and I'm so grateful to Roshan and the Institute for having me here. And as I understand, all of us here are civil servants aspirants. So, can some of you tell me what is your core motivation to become a civil servant?
Ma'am, I was inspired from the notion of Arthashastra, that is to augment the wealth and to distribute among the people. So for that, the power is required. So I am inspired for being a civil servant.
Wow, that is a very noble, I think, incentive, redistribution of society. So, bridging that social economic disparity gap and being that messiah for the disadvantaged people.
Most of the bureaucrats that I have encountered, I feel like they have some elements of arrogance, which is a kind of thing I really hate about. So, I think there is the need of some kind of people who could think in a different way so that, at least a smile could change lives. So, I think I could contribute in that regard. That's
I think that's also a very nice personal take on it, that with this kind of responsibility comes power, and therefore can come arrogance, can come corruption. So to maintain that kind of people-driven serving approach and not look at it as a hierarchy top-down approach is a very nice take on it as well. One important thing about being a civil servant, you will be a public leader. What means to be a public leader is you will have to raise voices for people who are voiceless. So the classroom is one safe space that you can share anything with without feeling any kind of embarrassment or anything, because that is where empowerment will start, especially as women. In our country, everybody will know that women especially have to struggle a lot to get education, to get jobs, to just get the right to speak.
Bring the underprivileged society to the front of the society, to bring equity in among the people.
Yes.
One of my friends was always saying that she got many difficulties in life as she was in scheduled caste, but later onwards she used to feel that she is not needed in the society, but I thought that they are also needed in the society. They should also be brought to the front of the society. So I think civil service is the best choice for that.
Wonderful. And it's so good to hear that you want to be a voice for the voiceless and a screen for the faceless in that sense. But I really hope that all of you who have these noble thoughts will take this approach when you actually become civil servants, because you know how we change when we get power. So the true judge of your character would be to retain these moral values and ethical systems once you become an officer. So, we all have heard that, about all these jargonic terms like transformative governance, this, that. But what does transformative governance truly mean? You see that India, we are at a juncture where we're trying to achieve that, Viksit Bharat 2047, but that has so many inherent challenges. So us as the future leaders, we don't just have to be implementers. And the executive body, we just don't have to be executioners. You all are policy entrepreneurs. You have to identify the problems. You have to think of new solutions. You have to be innovators, implementers, evaluators, and change makers. So just executing a rule-based order or some order that has been given to you from top down without using your brain may not serve the purpose. So with that goal, we start today's presentation. In the first half, I'll talk a little bit about Niti Aayog. I'm sure most of you have studied about it when you read about government institutions. So I will first ask you what it is. And after that, maybe I will share a few skill sets and competencies that you as civil servants will need to develop. Something when I was very young, somebody had told me that imagine that you have it and you will already be there. So if you start thinking of a mentality of a change maker, start thinking that you're already a civil servant, because your brain is already imagining you, you're affirming that, so you're halfway already that. So just imagine yourself that you have already got the post, and now this is the way we have to go forward. The Niti Aayog stands for the National Institute for Transforming India. It was established in 2015, not out of a statute, but more of an executive order. and it primarily acts as the think tank, the main think tank of the government of India. So any ministry, if they have a policy question, the labor ministry wants to know whether this labor policy should be implemented, or the environment or agricultural ministry does not know whether we should execute this scheme for the farmers or for irrigation or for soil health, they will come to Niti Aayog to seek a policy opinion which will be evidence-backed, which will feed into their decisions onto what kind of projects, what kind of programs that ministry should implement. So, and yes, its main mandate is to provide directional and strategic policy inputs to the central and state government. That it has changed from the Planning Commission days. Just to tell you a little bit how it has changed, first is during the Planning Commission days, it used to be a top-down approach. People who were full-time members in the Planning Commission used to decide, ki, okay, for the next 5 years, these are the programs which have to be done, this is the budget will be allocated to it, states are mandated to do so and so. Now it has become more of a bottom-up and consultative process in which Niti Aayog engages with the states. It asks the states, what are your problems, what are your needs, how can the center help you, in what sectors do you need help, and then they help them form the programs and plans. So from a more autocratic, power, top-down approach, it has become a more, kind of dynamic and consultative process. Secondly, a part where Niti Aayog has actually reduced its power. It used to have financial allocation powers to the states and different ministries, but now that power has gone to the Ministry of Finance. As mentioned, the roles of the state was very limited. Now it has increased exponentially. The products that it created was mostly 5-year plans. Today, it's, of course, a lot of opinions, but 15-year vision documents, or 7-year strategic papers, or 3-year action agendas. So irrespective of sector, these are the main outputs that come out of Niti Aayog. Earlier, they used to have full-time members. Now they even have part-time members, including lateral entrants. So at this juncture, why it's an optimistic thing is because we know the acceptance rate in the civil services. And many of us feel very sad that, we've not been able to crack. That is because we are thinking from a position of fear. But if we start thinking from the position of choice, that no, we have so many more choices in today's date, and we start thinking from the position of abundance, new opportunities open up. For example, in many ministries, this is happening, and we can discuss those opportunities later. In Niti Aayog, the positions of lateral entrance have opened up. So if you are a policy expert or you're a subject matter expert in any field like health, agriculture, you can actually join the department as a lateral entrant, where you get to work with the government for like 5 years or whatever tenure that you have, and then you can shift to another ministry or you can shift to a consulting firm, so on and so forth. So you directly get to make the change that you have without being within the system as such. So those are also options which are opening up. So the structure and governance of the institution is that we have the Prime Minister, which is the ex officio chairperson. Then we have a governing council, which comprises of all the chief ministers, all the lieutenant governors in India. And we have governing council meetings every year in which all these people come together, all the cabinet ministers are there, all the chief secretaries are there, and the states share all their problems, needs, in specific sectors, and we make a note as the nodal agency. Niti Aayog is responsible for coordinating that these states, all their needs are met by the ministry. So that communication, liaising, strategic connection between all the states and the center happens through Niti Aayog. Then we have a vice chairperson appointed by the PM, and there are a combination of full-time members who are subject experts and part-time members which are recruited from academia, research, etc. So that is another route you can enter the system, is that if you have developed good academic expertise or research-oriented skills, you can also come as a full-time member whose status is actually equivalent to the Minister of State. So I'm just trying to open your minds that don't think that if we don't make it, try your best, but there are many other ways that you can use your skills to enter the system and get, to these positions of power. So what do? We do a lot of things. That strategy paper, vision document was one thing. DMU is hosted out of Niti Aayog. It is the Data Monitoring and Evaluation Office. So what they do is, once all the schemes and all the programs of all the ministries are implemented, they have the monitoring role. They have the evaluation role. They have to come out with all the evaluation reports, which will help us decide with the expenditure, should we go ahead with this scheme, what should change in it. So it's the evaluation body. Then we have a Atal Innovation Mission, which basically is responsible for creating Atal Tinkering Labs and incubation centers. I'm sure you have heard of that. Then Team India. Then we have a data analytics wing. More and more, we are pushing towards technology-driven dashboards so that when you see data, then you have information to make decisions. Presently, many of us make intuitive decisions that, okay, our experience has showed this happen. Oh, or this has happened in that country, let us try it over here. But that is not the best way of making decisions. The best way is to look at data, analyze it, come out with your original thought and implement that. So towards that, creating dashboards like the SDG index, like the water management index, like the climate index is something that Niti Aayog and its special verticals are also doing. Then we have a state support mission. Now what happens here is that Niti Aayog has one nodal officer or actually an entire vertical dedicated to a particular state. So they do all the coordination with that state, host workshops, host sectoral sessions, get their problems on board, and they're responsible for that state. And then obviously there are knowledge and innovation hubs. That is a governing council meeting that I'm showing you. So a lot is going, we keep on coming out with different sectoral reports and all of that. So there is place for everybody over here. So the core functions of Niti Aayog then becomes strategy and policy formulation. So the reports, the different kinds of, one thing I wanted to talk to you about in this previous slide was that it's not only this, we have one division for every subject. Like we have for agriculture, rural development, frontier technology, industry, infrastructure, education, health, whatever sector, labor, whatever sector ministry exists, we have that subject expert division in it. So tomorrow, if you want to join one of those divisions as a subject matter expert, not only do you have roles in the ministry, but also within Niti Aayog. So yes, just summing up, the primary core functions is to provide advisory and policy support to central and state governments through the reports, then acting as the government's premier think tank, to promote cooperative federalism, so that state-center connect, and outcome-oriented monitoring and evaluation, so that we know where we are headed. We've not just done a program on and it's in the air and some media channel is talking about it. We actually have data to know whether it has achieved the ends it wants to or not. Okay, so at this juncture, I'm ending my overview of Niti Aayog and coming back to what your role could be as civil servants. I will not even say aspirants, as civil servants or people working in nation building in any field. It is that your role is not just to become an officer. It is to become the engine of implementation, innovation, and growth. So it's with that perspective that one needs to approach not only their preparation, but also their motivation of why you're getting into Viksit Bharat 2047. Who all has heard that term?
So currently we are in a band of a middle income country, a lower middle income country. So by 2047, we working on towards to become a developed nation. Well, the per capita income and the standard of living has raised to a level of a developed nation. So that by 2047, 100 year of our independence, India would be a developed nation.
Wonderful. Excellent answer. Excellent. You have absolutely got the broad gist of it, and I'm just going to concretize it for you. Maybe if a question comes related to that, or in case, because you will be future leaders, you will be working towards Viksit Bharat 2047, you should know what are the particular specific targets that we are looking at. So the first is, as you mentioned, yes, get economy and a per capita income at the level of high income countries. So we are talking about something in the range of $30 to 40 trillion. Around 6 to 9% of sustained GDP growth year on year. Then we don't only have economic targets. We also have human and social development targets. We have infrastructure and sustainability targets, and we have governance and innovation targets. So like that 30 trillion economy we keep on seeing everywhere in the news, etc., is just one of the many goals that we are setting for the Viksit Bharat 2047 vision. In terms of the human development, it is zero poverty and 100% literacy rate all over the country, not just the best in Kerala, but everywhere. So we need to achieve what we have in Kerala, at least in all the states going forward. Universal access to healthcare. So we are looking at life expectancy of more than 80 years in the majority of the population. And women's empowerment and financial inclusion. This has sub-metrics, but I'm not going into the specifics of it. World-class logistics and physical infrastructure. This component also has sub-metrics. One example is like 50,000 kilometers of access-controlled highways. So like this, we have many sub-matrices of each of these broad components that we are looking at. And a specific focus is going to be on global leadership in AI, space tech, and digital public infrastructure, because technology and AI is the way going forward. So specialized missions for that to stay ahead of the game, as we see many developed countries are doing. And the 4 pillars that we are focusing on, who has been listening to the different speeches of the Prime Minister, he talks about 4 categories of people that we need to focus on. So it is youth, it is women, it is farmers, and it's the poor. And obviously, many of these can be overlapping, but they have just separated this for benefit of that. And that comes down to what many people said, give a voice to the voiceless, give opportunity to the underprivileged. So this is just an endeavor towards that end. Viksit Bharat, we know. Anybody has heard about the net zero 2070 target? Or India's, anybody's heard about like the conference of party, conference that, has happened? You have heard, okay. Sustainable development goals, nationally determined contributions. Do these words make sense?
The government is going toward a goal of net zero carbon emission. It is to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions and everything. So we are going to be a net zero country by 2030 or 47. I don't know actually. The goal is that we will reduce our carbon emission and make Earth a safer place.
Okay, very good attempt. And what I want to ask is, why do you think as India we should achieve net zero? I mean, Europe and US, all these countries have become developed after industrialization, so they have been polluting. So now when it is our time to grow, why are we being forced into becoming this net zero neutral? Matlab, we should feel unfair, no? Ki matlab, like people in the West, they have in 1960s industrialization, they have been the major polluters. And in today's time, just because of some climate change related things, we as a developing country who should get the right to, level up our thermal power plants and manufacturing industries, we are being asked that, oh, no, you have to reduce and you have to sign the Paris Agreement. That is what India is known for, its ethics, its moral integrity, its place of welcoming everybody and giving environment the equal sacredness that human development also needs. So really balancing out, that is what all our religious scripts have talked about across all the religions, having a lot of sensitivity towards your environment, people around you, of all the nature. But there is also an economic angle to it. So to counteract the argument, we say that no, CBDR should be done. Of course, they should be done. More climate finance should come from the developed world because they have polluted, so they should help developing countries shift to green technologies, etc. But there is also an economic rationale for us to do it ourselves, apart from the Vasudev Kutumbakam and responsibility angle. It is the economic perspective. Do you know what AQI there is in Delhi right now? Yesterday I landed in Calicut. It was 84. I opened the map in Delhi. It had another 0. It was 840. And in the NCR region, it had crossed 1000. That is like smoking 20 cigarettes in a day. So a person doing yoga in Delhi has more chances to get a cardiac arrest than a person smoking in Bangalore or Calicut. That is the position we are at. What I'm coming to is that environmental conservation and sustainability has impact on health. So the AIIMS and all the big government hospitals in Delhi are being overburdened with people with respiratory issues. It is taking a direct hit on the exchequer because so much of finance has to be directed to these institutes. When an individual gets ill, they have to at a micro level take holiday from their, they have to take a leave from work, or productivity suffers. So those small things have a direct multiplier effect when you look at the macro level. So it's not just a very social and responsibility kind of a thing. And there are many such things, lot of studies which have correlated these kind of environmental problems with direct economic and productivity outcomes, which can be, we talk about leveraging the demographic dividend, youth population. Or if the youth population cannot drink clean water or cannot breathe clean air, what kind of growth can that population bring? So I'm talking in very simple terms, but I want you to understand that there is a higher scientific and economic rationale to also working towards sustainability apart from our commitments and Paris Agreement. More or less everybody was right. We have a commitment to achieve net zero. In the Panch Amrit that we say, we have the commitment to achieve net zero by 2070, to achieve 50% non-fuel, fossil fuel-based energy capacity by 2030, and also to reduce our carbon intensity of our carbon emissions by 45%. And there are many other such goals that we have reached. Some of them we have achieved, some of which we are in the process of achieving. But when I talk about all of these big targets, 5-year, 10-year, 50 years, 2070 goal, internationalization, becoming the leader of the global south, what do you think would be the role of the civil servants? Because the core truth remains that all of these targets will not be achieved by only policies of paper, but by all of you, by your competence, by your mindset, and by your execution. And of course, by your driving force that you have as civil servants. So, in the next part of my presentation, I will try to lead you through some, without getting into like the very detailed parts of it, but what are the kinds of skill sets and competencies you can develop that will not only help you as a civil servant, but God forbid one does not make it so, it will really help you in any sectoral policy or government aligned role that you decide to do going forward. You have heard of the rule of law, you have heard of things like accountability, transparency, efficiency, efficacy. So when I say rule of law, like a society to progress for schemes and projects and social initiatives to achieve their end, you need to have the rule of law. Difference between efficiency and efficacy. We keep on hearing, we have to increase the efficacy, we have to increase the effectiveness, and we have to increase the efficiency. So what is the difference between these three terms? Efficiency, efficacy, effectiveness. Efficiency is using the adequate amount of optimizing your resource utilization. So minimum input or adequate optimal input and maximum results. Efficacy is how well your intervention has performed but under controlled conditions. You have heard of randomized controlled trials, this, that, lab-based things. So efficacy is among controlled conditions when you're looking at an intervention, okay, I have to make this change at the district level or at the state level. Should I go ahead with this project or policy? So what you can do is, you can see whether it's working in controlled environments, I'll talk about it later, in small sample size population, and then if it works, you can implement it at a broader level to check its effectiveness. So when you check the how well a intervention is done at the society and broad level in real-time conditions, that is effectiveness. So with this, and which is the most important things, is that yes, the foundation, the principles of good governance, all the skills, competencies and all, everything that you can think of that you need will fall under these 5 or 6 main principles of governance, which you all have to remember if you want to become the harbingers of justice, or you want to bring about that kind of, really serve the people and not have power, or really bring about that underprivileged upliftment. Which are these 4 or 5 things? In very simple terms, rule of law would be upholding fair, practical, and predictable and impartial legal framework so that everybody knows that injustice will not be done to them. Everybody knows that all the decisions are based on legality and fairness. So what that means in real life could be independent judiciary and that your constitutional rights are being upheld. Second is transparency. I don't need to elaborate further. Public access to government information, what the decisions are, how those decisions are made, what data was used to make these decisions. So, your Right to Information Act or all these dashboards that Niti Aayog is coming up is one way of showing transparency to the public that, see, this is the data we are using, therefore this is the action, and we are doing our best to buy, and that makes you more accountable and answerable as well to the people. So how that is done in the government, you may have heard of the CAG audits or the Comptroller and Auditor General of India audits. So that happens. We have evaluations by the Monitoring and Evaluation Unit in Niti Aayog to see whether those schemes are being implemented, to make those ministries answerable that, okay, we have given you so much budget allocation, you are spending it on so many schemes, but are you actually achieving the results that you want to? Then it's participation, that as much as possible, all the stakeholders which will be affected by that decision should be taken into account in that decision making. So, for Vision 2047, we had like my government consultations and all of that. Efficiency, effectiveness, I've already mentioned to you. One way of achieving that efficiency and effectiveness was direct benefit transfers. You may have seen there was so much of leakage, corruption, and pilferage in terms of beneficiaries getting their share of, funds in different schemes. But direct benefit transfer has able to achieve that. And then finally, equity, inclusion, and consensus building. Now we know whenever a decision is made, you will ask everybody, okay, what you want, what you want, what you want. But finally, you have to do that kind of analysis. You have to balance different people's interests. And then you have to do what you think is the best in the larger interest of the society. But in order for that, maybe some people will get angry or some people may get sad. This intervention is not helping me, it is only helping them. And thwart the progress of that intervention. So stakeholder buy-in is very important. And in governance, we call that consensus orientation, which means you mediate between different interests and you try to have that communication and conversation that, okay, this was important to be done because it is helping this set of people or these goals. We will be balancing your interests with that goal so that those people are on board and they do not impede the proper implementation of what you want to. Okay, everybody has heard of the Swachh Bharat Mission. You all must be knowing about every scheme and every project better than me. So, Swachh Bharat Mission, what is the Swachh Bharat Mission?
Cleaning drives across all of the India.
Okay.
It was led by PM himself was leading the missions. He was making an example out of him. He was taking the broom and cleaning the road, and it was inspiring the whole nation.
Okay. It also has one more very important aspect. The cleaning aspect is obviously there.
Ma'am, social persuasion also was being included in it.
Okay.
So that people, there was a program and advertisement that if you are open defecating or
Yes.
not using toilets, etc., it is not good. So kind of image or influence was being created among the people, apart from budget allocations.
Great. So, making India open defecation free was one of the important aspects, and taking care of different forms of waste management were one of the main objectives of the mission. So, for people who have studied that mission, I have explained the governance principles earlier. Can you think of some ways? Do you think firstly that mission is a success or it's a failure?
I think it's a failure
Why do you think so?
because I'm a person who studied in northern part of India, and whenever I saw the places or things, it's always dirty or things.
Okay.
So I didn't see any policy that implemented that side. So I think it's a failure.
Okay, one reason. You have heard of Swachh Bharat. Do you think it's a success or a failure?
I think it is successful because it improves the sanitation not throughout the country, but at least some part of the country.
It has been partially success. In some areas there is success. For example, the Indore has been a great example. It has been one of the cleanest city in India. But we have seen the recent Kumbh Mela. There has been lot of open defecation and lot of waste. So there is grey areas too.
So what I'm hearing is that some people say it's a complete failure because you have not achieved the full gamut of things. Some people are saying at least there is some progress, so we cannot call it a complete failure. Some people think it's a success, at least fully in some areas. If you were responsible to execute the Swachh Bharat mission in your district or your area, what would you do to ensure that the mission is a success? Now you have to think like a civil servant. If many of you maybe not be aware of what it is, yes, it is zero waste, cleanliness in cities, making toilets to make these places open defecation free. So these are the kind of things that are done under Swachh Bharat. Your district, it has failed. Maybe some toilets have been made, maybe they are not being used, or maybe people, despite all the money being spent, they are still throwing waste, not in the dustbins but outside. You are the officer, you have been told that you have to make sure that your district is best. There are elections coming in 2 months. We have to do it. What would you do to ensure that it's a success?
Ma'am, first of all, I think it is not a fully failure because it is still going on in the name of Swachhata Hi Seva and all.
Yes.
By focusing on campuses and all. And if I am the civil servant who is making this decision, I will decentralize the process and give it to the Panchayati Raj institutions.
Yes.
Because from the grassroots itself, Grama Sabha is the minute point where everything begins. So from that we can understand the basic problems, basic necessities, and we can know the needs of the people and needs of specific areas and give and build a policy according to it. So grassroots level implementation will be good for Swachh Bharat mission, and people will show more accountability to things like because cleaning our environment ourselves shows a sense of accountability for us. So Swachh Bharat mission is also a thing that shows accountability and gives that to people, that it is our own, we should clean it, kind of thing.
Very good. And I think one practical thing that has come out of you is to utilize the Panchayati Raj institutions. So one thing that you need to remember as a civil servant is how do you delegate? How do you use the existing structures in your community and society to bring about a change? And it does not always, actually it should never be done many cases from an authoritative perspective, more from a community involvement perspective. So yes, you tap into whatever resources and whatever institutions that already exist at the grassroots level, because one thing you know is that Swachh Bharat mission is tracking how many toilets are made, how many districts are being cleaned, but are they tracking how much the toilets are being used? Are people actually developing those behavioral changes to use the infrastructure? Some of the things, like when I did the evaluation of Swachh Bharat, it came that people have created it, but now they're using it as storerooms, and women are still going to the forests and riverside areas to defecate because the behavioral change has not happened. So do you think that just creating infrastructure or just putting that in place will actually lead to change? No, because we are dealing with people and their minds and their behaviors and their habits. So that also becomes equally a part of our responsibility. And very good, so using Panchayati Raj institutions, holding sensitizations and sessions from the school level in that area, using the ASHA workers or the Anganwadi workers, school environment, and a lot of NGOs are going there to do Nukkad Nataks and street plays and, using art to spread awareness, using of your social media and all of those things. So that nudge approach is needed. So just you feel that, okay, the dashboard says, okay, wonderful, wonderful, but that doesn't mean the change has happened on ground. So in a certain way, yes, I would say that to a certain extent, Swachh Bharat has been a success. But why I'm always not, because there was participation. There were Swachhagrahis who drove local ownership. They played an important role in not only the planning, but the implementation and the monitoring. There was transparency in the sense that we had real-time dashboards, at least reporting how many toilets are being made, where the funds are going, which of the districts are utilizing the funds. There was social audit, so some amount of accountability was there, and there was some amount of behavioral change and all. But this has not been a lot of bottom-up buy-in through NGOs, etc. And all of them, have been to a certain extent captured. So what did this entail? This entails having a clear goal, getting all the stakeholders together, utilizing as much resources as you can at the grassroots level, having dedicated institutions and project management teams to execute it. But last mile delivery will only happen at the block level, at the really grassroots level, where community institutions, local stakeholder buy-in, and the role of you as officers is the most important. So now I'll talk about the policy mindset, coming back to what somebody mentioned here, that governance is not just, it is about executing the policies and rules, but it is also about identifying problems in society and thinking of solutions. So if you have to be a thinker of solutions, you cannot just be having a lot of knowledge, but you need to know how to think. So if you were a problem solver, decision maker, how do you think, so firstly, what kind of skills? So this is a question I asked you earlier. I did not get too much of a response. But once you become civil servants, you have to play many hats. You have to be a problem solver, a decision maker. You need to know noting and drafting. You need to know implementing, monitoring, evaluation, coordination and liaising between interdepartmentals, data analysis, then only you can do evidence-based policy making. Having knowledge of public finance and budgetary systems, program and project design, impact assessment, communication, negotiation, team building, oh my God, so much. But are we prepared for that? we think, this is so overwhelming, oh my God, so many skill sets. But yes, this is at least a certain part of what your role will entail as civil servant. So we feel, oh my God, we have cracked the exam, now our lives are perfect. But that is where the real challenge starts. When you are given the responsibility of upholding justice, of creating that social value, of driving growth at the grassroots level, when you become the hopes of millions and in fact billions of people in our country, you know what a huge responsibility you have. And these roles are just very few of the ones you will have to do. But there is a very simple mindset change and very simple process that you can develop, which will help you, in your decision making, problem solving, implementing roles in a very simple way. The nitty-gritties, technicalities, you can always catch later. But developing a simple policy mindset is good enough for you as a starting point at the broad level. Usually what happens is that when we get a problem, we end up addressing the symptom. Okay, there is a flood in this area, let's just create an embankment, let's just put mud over it, there is a little flow of water, let's just cover it up. Okay. There are girls, they are not being able to go to school, let's just give them transport to go to during whatever hours. So you feel that you are addressing the problem, but are you really addressing the problem? You can never address the problem if you don't know the problem. And half the things that I have witnessed, and most of my colleagues are witnessing when we get proposals from different ministries, when we get proposals from state, is the schemes and projects that they give look so good on paper. But when we see the intervention and then we look at the data of what the problem is, we see a mismatch. Maybe that girl is not able to go to school, not because maybe the distance is not far, maybe there is a safety issue. So it's not about the access, it's about the safety. Similarly, there may be so many things. Maybe the flood, just putting mud over it doesn't make sense. You have to look at where the leakage is and plug it there. But many of the times, we don't want to use our brains. We want to take a shortcut. And we never really address the problem. So the core thing in whatever role you are in, whatever position, whatever sector you are in, is that you need to find the root cause of the problem and not just treat the symptom. If you really want long-term sustainability, treating the system is just, once the bandage comes off, the blood will start flowing again. The second most important principle is, and I will tell you a small way in which you can do this, small thinking exercise in which you can do this. Another decision is that where is government intervention really required? How many of us are like economics students or have done their bachelor's in maybe economics, or you have done? Now I'll ask a generic question. Knowledge of economics, like I am a lawyer. And when I entered into policy, there was a very simple thing that I was told. A lawyer without the knowledge of economics is a public enemy. Similarly, an engineer without the knowledge of sociology or society and economy would also be that. Why? Because then we will think in silos. We will think just from our disciplinary perspective, maybe just infrastructure or just legality or just administrative convenience. But when you are in decision-making powers, like my role, I'll just break it a little bit, talk to you about my role. I get schemes and projects worth like 20 lakh crores. So like 30, 300 billion, 100 USD billion worth of projects. And I single-handedly have to look at it from a financial, economic, legal, technical, which is the engineering infra part, administrative, like the feasibility, and the sustainability aspect, so the environmental thing. One person having to look at the problem from all these angles for multiple sectors. But you will also perhaps have to do it, or at least engage with consultants who will be giving you reports. Like you engage some consulting firm as a civil servant that, okay, I have this problem in my district, give me a report. Now these consulting, please don't quote me anywhere and don't publish this. They may create a lot of good jargon in their reports. There'll be a lot of good English, a lot of like fancy words, but we as people make it feel, wow, yeah, there's so many presentations, there are so many charts, there are so much of data and all happening. But is it actually making sense? Half of the times they're using hi-fi language to come out with outputs that look very fancy, but when you see that, oh my God, this is what ChatGPT or something like that. So what becomes very important is you yourself need to have the ability to do that analysis and to understand the evidence. Then only you can catch somebody else's problems, because you will be using these data points, these reports, these consultants coming and telling you do it this way. But if you don't know, then they can feed you anything, and then you don't have the knowledge how to work, and you will listen to them, which may or may not lead to that kind of outcome. So, but that's the problem identification analysis part. So, when we talk about government intervention, before lawyer, I had done my sociology degree also. So, as a student of sociology, I was all full of energy and, protesting against every government intervention and raising voices for the underprivileged, etc. Like, maximum of my lawyering days was actually done in public interest litigation. But then I realized that, then I used to say, government is not doing this, government has to do this. And you as civil servants and maybe decision makers will face it all the time. Whenever you will go in your district or block, people are like, sir, you are not doing anything, I have this problem, I have that problem, government should do this, government should do that. But as civil servants, do you spend money on everything? Because money is limited. You may get a budget, it will be limited. You need to know where to spend that money. And of course, maturity will tell you how to spend that money. But 2-3 simple things that need to be kept in mind when you decide to spend money is it a market failure? Many a times, there is something in economics, public good, private good. Many a times there are problems in society which can actually be corrected by economics. Like there is a problem, some startup will come. There is a problem, some industry or NGO person will come and fill in the gaps. But then there are some problems in which nobody will do anything about it, and that is where government needs to intervene. But if there is something which can be taken care of by the industry, let it be. Let us spend money on something which is worth it. More worth it. Is it a public good? This is technical, excludable, non-excludable, all of those things. And does it have strategic national interests? So is it just catering to like few pockets of populations or few interest groups or other motivations political? Or is it actually a large-scale national kind of interest on a problem that we are dealing with? But this market failure thing is something that you must keep in mind. You will see, okay, this is also a problem, this is also a problem, this is also a problem. I have 10 rupees. Where do I spend that 10 rupees? So this mindset will help you decide how to go about doing it. Okay, now I talked about problem, that root problem versus the symptom. There is this technique called the 5 whys technique, which means you keep on asking why, till you achieve the root cause. And how does this happen? I'll give you a small example. Over here, imagine that the state government has submitted some kind of tourism sector report for clearance at the central government level. This is actually a case which has happened with me, so I quoted it. And we rejected it. Why? Second why. Because they did not include an environmental impact assessment or the forest clearance assessment that report needed to have. So we said, okay, this project will not be given. It became a big political issue. Then those guys start thinking, the civil servant, they started questioning, oh, why did you not do this environmental impact report? Because the consultants who were able to do that report, they were not hired. Some random consulting firm was hired to make a generic report. Okay. Why were the consultants not hired? Because the tendering process was defunct. Why was the tendering process defunct? Because the approvals for the tender is centralized and it's not decentralized amongst the people who were making decisions. And the central agency took a lot of time. Tendering didn't happen, consultants didn't happen, environment report didn't come, proposal went and failed. So what they realized is that the root problem is just to take care of your administrative system. And okay, a root cause is largely where you can make a change at an administrative level, where you see okay, shifting this governance angle or administrative angle can help you address a cause which will have a ripple effect, is where you know ki this is where the change has to be made. It will come with time, it will come with practice, but the 5 whys is something I'd like you to remember. This is a very simple example, but as you develop your skill, you can use it in any context. You can use it in the private sector or anything else. So this is something I want you to take with you. A little more about this is that a lot of times, and this is my take from my experience as a negotiator, as a mediator. Mediator is something who comes out with win-win solutions. Is that many times when two parties are fighting, they are fighting against each other. They're not fighting against the problem. Similarly, as civil servants, we must not, you feel that, okay, being authoritative, scolding your juniors, all of these things can increase efficiencies. Sometimes it is required, but a lot of times some small systemic changes can automize and automatically make this, system more efficient. So you target the process more than the people. If you think you have made the process perfect, and then people are being inefficient, okay, then you scold them. But just, scolding them may end up being a bad solution. You're not targeting the problem over there. Then stop this 5 why, stop where you think that the problem can be addressed administratively. And it's not necessarily that for one problem, one chain of 5 whys work. Sometimes one problem can have different causes, and each of those causes can have multiple 5 whys. So if a problem has 3 problems, then you do this 5 why thing of each of those problems, and then you address the final 3 things that come at that level. So it's not necessary, because problems can be causal, so you need to keep that in mind. Okay, now this is a little technical, but would be required at whatever level you're in, especially if you're taking in very technical information, is that as analytical leaders, we're talking about developing a policy mindset, we have to compare alternatives. Just because things are going on, just because somebody has given you some project, some policy, doesn't mean you take it at value. That legacy kind of thinking, okay, this has been going on for such a long time, this can be continued, is not the approach to have. At this real time, you must do alternative analysis. For example, we have some kind of road project. Do we put in public money? Do we get private sector investment? Do we make it a public-private partnership model? Do we use the HAM model? What are the alternatives I have to achieve that goal, and which will be the most, go back to the governance principle, efficient, efficacy-based, accountability-driven, fiscally prudent way of tackling the problem. Second thing, and for that, we do a sensitivity analysis, which is, I'll explain that later. Then it is doing a cost-benefit analysis. Sometimes we just look at some solutions from the economic perspective, okay, or the cost perspective, not only the economic. Any difference between finance and economics? When I say, okay, this program or this project or this intervention is financially good versus this is economically good. What is the difference, finance versus economics? So in the projects, we often look at internal rate of return in terms of finance. We've put in this much money, is it creating those kind of infrastructure? Okay, but does it also have a multiplier effect? Is it creating true public good, true public value for the society? Is something that we need to take into account after the alternative analysis. And finally, like we do as lawyers, we look at past case laws. You must look at past evidence in terms of what are the evaluations that have been done, what are the reports in that area before implementing anything. Second part. First, I talked about analytical thinking. Now I'm talking about adaptive leadership. There are many civil servants who would have come and talked to you and told you about their experience as civil servants. Has anybody taught you, told you about, they are feeling frustrated that, processes are like this or that? Anybody has shared their, change is not happening, change is very slow, that kind of input. So what we think is that, what we are, seeing is that in many ways our system was perfection driven, in the sense that we wanted our plans to be perfect before implementation. Everything needs to be in place. You need to have a big picture, grand design. Everything has to be stable. No risk should be taken. And that is something we feel has led to a paralysis of analysis. In the sense that we've been analyzing so much, we have been thinking so much, we need to come to the perfect outcome, that nothing really happens. Or if it happens at a very slow level. And if we want to achieve that vision 2047, we cannot afford to do this. But how do you implement it at that block level? How do you implement it at the, the district level? It is a process that, requires developing of a new mindset, of innovation, of constant learning, of transformation, of agility. And how do we do that? 3 steps. I don't want to give too much information to you. So one, I talked about the governance principles. One, I talked about the problem analysis and government intervention. And in adaptive leadership, I'm talking about how do you choose what to implement? What is the simple basic step that one takes? So first is to pilot an intervention. Once you have done all your analysis and all to come to a certain information, you pilot it. You choose a small geography, choose a small sample size of representative population, and you try out the intervention with it. To check what we call the theory of change. Ki the inputs that have been put in, do they lead to the outputs and the outcomes? If you feel there is a success, you evaluate it properly based on real world conditions, and then you kind of scale it up. Or you pivot it in the sense that you use the information that you have received from that pilot, make those changes, okay, this does not work, this does not work, this does not work, and you pivot it to then test it again in the lab conditions, and then you scale it up, you repilot. So there is something, okay, in Hindi, I don't know how much like people will know, it's like हम जब कुछ करते हैं तो या तो जीतते हैं या तो सीखते हैं. What that means is if we do something, you either win at it or you learn from it. So the idea of that, waiting for things to be perfect, waiting for that perfect plan doesn't always lead to transformative changes in the fast way that we want. Yes, we want it to be data backed, we want it to be evidence based, but we also want it to be done quickly. And this is a process through which that can be done. One example was through the Pahal LPG scheme. Direct benefit transfer was tried through that first. And now you see that direct benefit transfers are being done in many schemes like the PM Kisan Yojana, and there are many other subsidy-oriented schemes where the money is directly going to the beneficiaries, but it started as one pilot. So yes, and of course, the role of evaluation bodies, monitoring bodies, and all of that becomes very important. This is something that we do over there. It's a little higher level central government thing, but state governments also do it when they're implementing large scale projects. We have project management units, which are specialized units which are tracking the progress of your project. We have war rooms, which kind of are like mission control centers. They keep on tracking the data, what is going, which district is going down, which has a low fund utilization, which has low outcomes, and making those changes or, making them accountable that you need to do it. Because earlier there was no data, no information, no tracking, so anybody would do anything and we'll have no information to try it. To see are those key performance indicators, being matched. And obviously, measurable outcomes. Now this is something that we all are really trying to promote across the bandwidth. Is people say, okay, this will generate employment, this will lead to economic growth, this will lead to poverty alleviation. Okay, very nice. Exactly what does that mean? So for each one of the projects or programs or schemes, we have very measurable key performance indicators. These many people will be getting a per capita income of this much. These many tap water connections which will just have this much of particulate matter. This is the rate of fund optimization we are looking at. So very specific measurable things to achieve those broader things like economic growth, population, poverty alleviation, and all of that. So very concrete things that can be measured using numbers or qualitative inputs to measure that. Otherwise, like I said, it's just English. Like many of these evaluation reports that come, they're just, they don't make sense without any data. So that becomes very important. And this was an example I gave earlier that earlier there used to be that middleman thing. Now also it happens to some extent, but it's better because of that streamlining of fund flow. Now the money directly goes to the people. So earlier there was a lot of pilferage, a lot of leakage, but through DBT and Aadhaar linked, all of that, it's improved. Okay, now I've told you all the competency skills, the policy mindset, the leadership mindset, the 5 whys and all of that. But there are some biases that we need to take into account when we think of that. Sometimes what we do is that we are so happy with the intervention, wow, I've created such a nice thing, that we have an optimism bias. We look at the positives more than the challenges, or we overestimate the benefits over the cost. So what is very important is you take out, okay, what are the basic variables that I should keep in mind to execute, when I'm executing something, what are the basic variables I need to measure the most? and realistically see how those variables perform in different scenarios. A scenario where there can be political agitation, a scenario where a certain flood can come, those different scenarios, and then you see, is your intervention actually sensitive towards that or not? And of course, you need to see what is the best mode of delivery. There can be many ways of once you reach a project, there can be many ways of implementing it. Do you create a special purpose vehicle? Do you create a project management unit? Do you use existing government structures? Do you get consultants on board? So many different ways of implementation. And lastly, of course, collaboration with the states, with people at the grassroots level, and with the top policy experts, because change can happen both only when it's top down, but most importantly, bottom up. So yes, one thing that we are seeing, and I think I would like to I am going to end my lecture soon, is the integration of AI and technology in government systems, not just in the schemes, like I'm talking about Digital India, I'm talking about DBT and all of that, but just leveraging technology in government functioning, making things automatic, creating dashboards, grievance redressal systems, or just fund being released in an automated manner. A whole of the government and an e-governance approach is what is being really, really talked about at the central government mission. We are funding the national AI mission because we want to become the world leaders. So AI and frontier technology is a very big thing at NITI and what the government is trying to back. So as you go forward as policy leaders, have to try to integrate technology in your everyday working and in the decisions that you're making. The BharatNet is one way in which we're trying to make broadband and reach to the villages and all of those things. So GovTech is actually a buzzword that all of you must read upon going forward, and the integration of technology in your functioning. So yeah, these were just few examples of that kind of digital integration which have been successful models. I'm sure you're aware of them. Coming to the end of the presentation, what is your role as future leaders? Just summing it up, it's two ways: your brain and your heart. The way you think, analyze, look at problems, solve problems, and the way you implement, deal with stakeholders, make sure everybody is taken along all the way, and how good of a leader you are. So, analytical leader, knowing what to do, using frameworks that I talked about to come to your decisions, and when you're implementing, having adaptive flexibility. So using data, using experimentation to deliver real-world impact. So I would like all of you, once you become leaders, I think all of you are leaders, you crack the civil services, great, or you will become leaders in some domain or the other. So be someone who just doesn't execute what is given to them, but who's also able to diagnose the problems, make designs, adapt, execute, and actually ensure that change happens at the grassroots level. So with that, I'll just, your role is not just to clear the exam, but it's actually to develop that mindset which will reach, make the nation reach the 2047 Viksit Bharat goals. So with that, I'll just close my presentation here. So thank you very much for your attention and participation.
One of the challenge that faced from changing to planning commission, changing to Niti Aayog from planning commission is limited financial autonomy. So what are the challenges that faced to strengthen the cooperative federalism?
First, I think, is that the decision to remove the financial allocation powers was an executive one. Now, if we look at the impact of it, the power has shifted from one government body to another government body. What we have to see is that the institution of appraisals of that allocation, has that also become less transparent? Has that become politically driven? Has that led to less accountability? I think not. Because as I mentioned earlier, okay, I'll explain how projects are financed. That will answer your question. There are different committees which deal with different kinds of projects. There is a railway board separate for that, projects separate committee for that, and schemes, expenditure finance committee is for that. It is chaired by the expenditure of Secretary of the Ministry of Finance, Department of Expenditure. The other representatives of the Ministry of Finance there, The head of the project appraisal and management division of Niti Aayog is a very main member, and all the representatives of that line ministry are sitting. Suppose there is a scheme for agriculture. If that scheme is dealing with water, then water resources people will also be there, labor will also be there. If it has some educational angle, maybe education person will be there, fisheries will be there. So whoever is connected with that scheme, sit in that meeting. Then what happens is the proposal comes to all those meetings. It's a very huge proposal. It has the evaluation report, it has the data, etc. And we have to do the appraisals, is to recommend whether to go ahead with the project, what to change in the project, and how much budget to allocate to it. So each of these ministries do that appraisal and they send their comments to the main line ministry, whose core proposal it was. Once those comments are sent back, they use those comments to change the scheme or to change the structure of the project, which then they go to, we have our meetings at the Rashtrapati Bhavan in the Ministry of Finance, where everybody sits together, everybody shares that points. The main ministry will, talk about the entire presentation of that new scheme. And then everybody gives their second layer of comments that, okay, you have made these changes. Now, okay, this aspect is left, this aspect is less. All of that is heard and minuted. And finally, Secretary Expenditure decides, okay, this scheme will go ahead with this much financial allocation, but as long as these things are kept in mind. So I think at one level, that process of evaluation and appraisal has actually not been that diluted. It remains transparent, because it's the same people working both. There are government servants here, there are government servants there. There, Planning Commission was making all the decisions. Here, all the line ministries are there, Niti Aayog is there, expenditure is there, so it's a more consultative and a more transparent process than that. That's your first question. Cooperative federalism has, of course, increased more, especially through the governing council of the Niti Aayog, which consists of all the chief ministers, it consists of all the lieutenant governors. In our governing council meetings, all the cabinet ministers are also sitting. Our honorable prime minister is also there. Each of the states give full speeches on what are their demands from the central government. Somebody from the northeast will say, okay, we had given that proposal for that hydropower project. It has been sticking for such a long time. Us as Niti Aayog nodals will make a note of that. I'm talking at a very ground, real level so that you can understand. And then we will follow up to make sure that those particular requests or wants are communicated to the respective ministry, which will be then asked to, take it up at priority or consider that. Some people come with policy level suggestions that, we need your help in building our Viksit Bharat state level vision. So Niti also has a separate vertical for Viksit Bharat strategy papers where we help state make their vision. Some people want some kind of reformatory help or some kind of executionary help. So the state support mission of Niti Aayog helps. So I think the cooperative federalism structure has actually improved with the changing of Niti Aayog from the Planning Commission, because first only one body would decide. But now states are constantly in touch with different departments at Niti to affect the decisions and take the help for them to make their decisions. So that has increased. I'll talk about both my role here slightly previously and with MC Mehta sir. My role here is primarily to do the technical appraisals of all the projects and all the schemes of all the ministries of the Government of India, because we are in that confidential unit, which has the only division which has continued from the Planning Commission days. We used to call it Project Management and Appraisal Division. Now we call it Public Finance and Policy Analysis Division. But unlike the subject matter experts, we get schemes, projects, railway proposals from every ministry. So one day I'm doing, say, a fast track court scheme of the legal ministry. The next day I'm doing PM Kisan. Next day we are appraising some airport project. Next day I'm doing some minority affairs ministry scheme. So it's a wonderful dynamic place to be, and like I mentioned, have to look at it from all the angles. Financially viable, is it economically feasible, is it socially equitable, administratively, legally, sustainability. So you have to have that holistic approach. Then before this, I was actually a consultant working with the Ministry of Commerce, Government of India. Another thing I want to share, so many lateral entry opportunities where you can choose to be and join in different capacities. There I worked with who is now the Secretary Commerce, He was the chief negotiator for many international free trade agreements. So got to travel a lot with him, learn negotiations in different countries and really negotiate for India in our free trade agreements or plurilateral agreements in different nations. So that was a great experience. Before that, I'd worked with the UK government in their education and international trade division on their strategy. But I came back because I loved my country. I had a role there, but I just wanted to come back. I was like, this is where I belong. Before that, in my role, I'd actually worked before the Chief Justice of Jammu and Kashmir. And the administration there for a good 1.5 years. So that was a great experience. Also, we were working with the administrative station, driving access to justice. So very interesting project we worked on called Insaf Ki Dastak, which means getting justice to the doorsteps of the people. Now in Jammu and Kashmir, we must be aware there are some security related issues. During the really bad weather conditions, people are not able to reach basic public services or courts. So we created a technology-driven system in which the post offices could be used to do their filings for the court cases, which would reach their court, and the virtual hearing, centers were set up. Those virtual hearings were done, and the court order would be faxed to them through those centers. So we did a lot of such initiatives to take access to the justice. So that is also one place where the judiciary worked with the state administration to reach a social goal. So we don't work in silos. Judiciary has to help the executive, which has to take from the legislature, so on and so forth. Before that, in my role as a lawyer in a public interest litigation role, I think that was my passion. But it draws from my days in sociology, where I used to, I used to protest and, all the Nirbhaya or women's rights, educational problems, caste, this. I was always like, oh, Corbona, Lorbona, I'm Bengali anyway, so I have that in my blood. But then I realized that maybe it's not enough. I am using my awareness to raise a question. But how am I using my knowledge to make a change? So then I came across that law could be used as a powerful tool to bring about social change. That was my motivation to do law. It was not to become like a corporate lawyer or work that. Another thing I realized that law also, maybe public interest litigation, can have a little bit of cap. Because if, for example, you don't come from a very privileged background, you cannot just keep on working without money. So then I'm like, I want to do something more to bring about more holistic change. Okay, law is one angle. So then I went to Cambridge to do my MPhil in public policy, where we learned everything. We learned public administration, statistics, economics, finance. So today I'm able to work in policy roles where you can, use all your skills. So in your 3 questions, I think I have traced my entire career history to you.
I'm very pleased to know that you are part of COP 28 negotiator of as Indian delegation. Last year, there have been Baku conference COP 29. Despite the developing nations have been demanding for the $1.3 trillion per year, the developed nations have only approved 300 billion per year. My question is that if our negotiations were sharper, could we expect more, or is it the moral paralysis of the developed nations? My second question is that you're a Kathak artist. Recently, they have a recent initiative in Delhi airport that I remember it as Del Vibes.
They have the performers perform at the airport.
Yes. There have been concerns raised that it's being objectifying the tribal arts. Being a performing artist, what is your take on it? This is my 2 questions.
Thank you so much. I love these 2 questions because, they humanize my entire intellectual jargon. So to the first question, I say, when we go for negotiations, we have a very stringent process of what happens behind the negotiations. We have to set certain red lines, yellow lines, green lines. And these are something we don't tell the other party, but that happens through interministerial meetings and consultative processes with the respective line ministries which have a concern. For example, Power Ministry may have a problem that they will talk about, say, toning down thermal power plants and ramping up, say, oil and natural gas, because there are some countries who are good at oil and natural gas. They may try to push certain technologies like carbon capture and sequestration, which may be expensive for us. So it's about firstly doing those internal consultations, having those yellow lines, red lines, and green lines. But when you go, you say, okay, okay, nothing works. And then you say, okay, people are like, no, you have to do this. So we give away our green lines. Okay, yeah, this will cooperate, but you need to do this. It's always a trade-off. Then we talk about a yellow line. Suppose there is consensus, because Paris Agreement is a consensus-based thing, COP negotiations. Most countries are saying, okay, we will do this kind of technology or we'll bring this kind of intervention. No, our line ministries told us that it's very expensive and we need money for something else. Maybe we're not able to do it. So that is a point we need to go back to the line ministries and ask them again that, see, these many nations have already had this kind of consensus and most people are agreeing, maybe we're on the sideline. Please reconsider if you can have us as the Commerce Ministry, nodal ministry. We have the mandate, but for major decisions, we have to go back to the line ministry and take it. But the red lines are something that we know we will never thwart, irrespective of that. Like you may have heard of the India-US standoff. Like our markets are just going up and down because of that, because agriculture is a very sensitive issue for us. It's maybe economics for them, but it's sustenance and lives for us. So it's, farmers' lives and their livelihoods versus maybe some profit for some corporations in the US. So that's a non-negotiable. That is something that we will never agree on. Then you may think negotiations are fancy, but for most of the time we are negotiating one word. Should it be inhibited coal power, uninhibited coal power, unabated coal power, underabated coal power? Full hours and hours go to correct each and every word. Why? Because once we sign on that dotted line, we are liable to implement that. So unabated versus abated versus no, yes makes a big difference. So as lawyers, it's all about playing around with the words. In terms of climate finance, yes, the developed countries have a major role to play, but it's only incentive based. It's not something we can enforce on them. Yes, it should be their duty under CBDR. If they don't do it, what can we do? We know climate change is a reality which is going to affect us. In my discussion, I talked about the health and the economic problems. Agriculture is going to get affected. If the temperatures change over here, the environment that we have for agriculture will shift to Europe. And European temperature will shift to, say, even up north. So the little advantage we have in our agrarian society, which still comprises of more than 50% of our population, will be taken away from us. And, floods will come and natural disasters. So it's important for us to have mitigation and adaptation. In terms of finance, yes, we have other development goals to apply for, but more and more we're talking about creating an investment-friendly environment in green technologies, in systems like green hydrogen, solar power, wind, EV batteries, so all of that. So what we are working more at the government level is giving production-linked incentive schemes. Niti Aayog has spearheaded a ease of investment-friendly index. What that does is, like you talked about cooperative federalism, competitive federalism also. Like we will create healthy competition between states. We have given them certain parameters. We are creating a dashboards and we are going to play the states against each other that, okay, your state is doing well in land use or natural resources. Your state is doing better in regulations and single window clearances. So everybody can see what the other state is doing in terms of investment friendliness. So what we regard is, instead of asking for the funds which are not in our hands, we have to create that money through different systems of climate finance, social impact bonds, green bonds, blue bonds. There are so many funds that are there, taking help from or maybe aid from multilateral organizations and creating an environment where people want to come and invest in clean technologies, in green tech. So that is the way to go about it. We cannot keep on complaining. We have to be proactive. Okay, the next question. Yes, about the artists on the thing. It is a very thin line. When I was a pure Kathak dancer, what I had a problem in was the rigidity in which tradition is important, but there is also rigidity and norms which come with it. Once you're educated in the liberal arts, you start questioning everything. So I was questioning, why do I always have to do Krishna and Radha? Why do I always have to play Meera, something like Radha or some, that Krishna's Sakhis who are, Chhed Chhad and Draupadi's, that sari, Astar, in the Mahabharata and all of that. Why can't we play more contemporary and modern kind of themes? Then is when I created Shrinkhala, where we use different Indian classical and contemporary art forms to create productions on topics like global warming, women empowerment, farmer suicides, and we've performed in different countries in a very, sensitive way. That was also criticized a lot. Ki, Arey, you are tweaking the Indian classical dance forms to do these contemporary things. These are not the tradition and all of that. But then I made sure it's called contemporary and not Kathak. I said contemporary dance based on Kathak. So I think whenever change happens, there is opposition to it. So that was my personal journey. In terms of the objectification part, it really does not really depend on the so-called patrons and harbingers of the high societies of classical dance or tribal arts over there. You have to ask the particular artist who is dancing or performing over there, how are you feeling when you're performing? Are you feeling respected? Are you feeling valued? Or you feel you're like some commodity which you just have to do it because there are no other economic there? Because for an artist, yes, money is important. It's very important, but more is the respect. More is that, the audience appreciating it. So we need to talk to them to get their perspectives. The people who are working there, not the people sitting at the high levels are, honorarium people who that. If you're not feeling respected, then 5 whys, identify the problem. You're not feeling respected, why? You have been given some stage on the corner, people are going with their shoes, okay. You elevate the stage, you bring the stage to the center. You create like a network around it where, people are told you can, don't, do these kind of analysis, you put up those signboards, you give them that lighting and that sound, so they are not just kind of some showpiece, but they are the center of that. So one has to ask them how you feel and then go about it. We are nobody to talk for them.
Hi, what I want to ask is that you said about that interministerial meetings and all that before you're doing that negotiation. So when ministries have different policies and goals, they need to come into the policy table. For example, Ministry of Power have a goal, but MRCC have another goal which is contradicting. So how you are balancing or how you are selecting with which you are proceeding in policy making? And another thing I want to ask is that you said about on 2047 we have the goal to be a Viksit Bharat. So currently our economic growth is not up to that level that we reach there. So what else we can do, especially our investment, all those are decreasing and it is such a decadal low for the last 10 years. So in this changing uncertainties in this economic sphere, how we are navigating to be in 2047 to be a Viksit country. And last question, okay, you're in a passionate person to basketball, dance and all that, and professionally you are in another. So how are you balancing this passion and profession?
Wow, I feel I'm being interviewed for this episode final round. Wonderful questions. I think in the first question, I would say that we have not really come across contradictions in the goals and priorities of ministries. It's just that they mostly work in silos. So yes, sometimes, for example, you may feel that thermal power plants are being increased at one end, and at the same time, the MOEFCC is responsible for reforestation, which may seem contradictory, but it's just that ministry's mandate, and it all stems from the need of the country. Whereas, yes, we need more renewable power, we need more green forest cover, we need more green technology, but we cannot run away from the fact that our population is increasing and the consumption needs and especially energy security is at stake. And especially when you look at the geopolitical angle, you know that our supply chains can be blocked by geopolitical factors. You may be reading in the newspapers what is happening. So we have to become Atmanirbhar or self-sufficient in that sense. Then you look at the money. Do we have that much money to invest in renewable energies? Can the renewable energy actually create that much energy to help, fulfill all our energy security needs? The intention is very clear that yes, we need to reduce that and you need to increase this. But you need to know that people over here, especially the underprivileged, should not suffer because of that. So it's everybody is working together. Just focusing on your ministry. Environment Ministry is, helping with the clean tech and the reforestation and the coastal mission and the Clean India mission. And Power Ministry is also doing it. Renewable energy is trying to wrap that up. The goal is to reduce coal and fossil fuel and increase that, but it cannot be done absolutely suddenly, because how will you then, cater to the energy security needs? Mostly the competition in interministerials is not between the ministries. Sometimes it is more like what the ministries want and what international countries want. For example, the developed countries want us to have very high standards in labor, gender, environment in our manufacturing chains. Now, they did not cater to all of that when they did their industrialization, but today they say ki, no, environment and labor and gender is very important to us, so you must have that as a chapter in the free trade agreement. For us, we look at that as a comparative advantage. A lot of, not that it's a good thing, there is no moral judgment to it, but slightly cheaper labor, slightly lax environmental safeguards is regarded to be something that makes your production cheap, which makes your goods in a very economic sense competitive at an international level. So without saying whether it's good or bad, it is as it is. So it is being seen more like a strong arm tactic that, developed countries have done that discrimination at that time. Now when it is for the developing countries to use their comparative advantage, you are telling us, okay, do environment, do this. But that's the reality, and I think as Vasudeva Kutumbakam kind of accepting country, we need to have that higher moralistic stance. So it's more about harmonizing what the ministries want, not against each other, but what the other people at the international stakeholder want. So it's a constant communication, constant negotiation, and then finally, it takes years to finally, get a free trade agreement done. The second thing was about the economic growth rate, and I think that is exactly the reason why all of these initiatives are happening. The schemes, the target beneficiaries which are being taken up. There are so many ease of doing business, for example, indexes and initiatives, investment-friendly index, digitization, GovTech, AI. Increasing efficiency in government functioning, then data-driven decision-making, dashboards, accountability, evaluation. Now, through that things, we can constantly track how states are performing, in what indices they are coming out, giving them that kind of capacity building and knowledge support from the center, getting international bodies like the World Bank, ADB, NDB and all on board to help with technology transfer, knowledge sharing, finance, all of those things, skilling. So a lot is being done, but a lot has to be done also. And we are a democratic nation, so we cannot have an authoritative top-down way of doing things, which means we will go slower, but we will go more fairer because we will be taking into account everybody's interests. And of course, it is your role as a civil servant to make sure we reach 2047. So it boils down to individual stakeholders in the entire government machinery and also as civic citizens. Half the reasons why Swachh Bharat has failed is not only because government, it's because we decide to spit and we decide to open defecate. So our responsibility as citizens. Lastly, how do I balance? Is because I do it out of joy. Dance gives me a lot of joy, representing my nation in negotiations or working in policy. Really, that is what motivates me, giving back to society, giving back to my country. So I think if you're doing what truly gives you joy, what aligns truly with your value system, time management automatically happens, prioritization, hard work, discipline automatically comes. So it's just about aligning what you do with your value system and goals. So I think that's it.
Being a policy expert, you would have studied in detail about the poverty elevation programs in Kerala, or for that matter, why South Indian states, they have high HDI index compared with the North Indian states. So, studying on it in a detailed way, what do you think is the root cause, or what is hindering North Indian states from being getting a good HDI index, or for that matter, elevating the poverty? What do you think is the root cause? I just want a personal opinion of yours.
Yeah, it is a personal opinion. Please do not, I'll give the disclaimer. It's not my organization's worldview. I think a large thing is to do with the mindset, to how we look at education, how we look at development, how we look at equal opportunity, how we look at gender, how we look at concepts of patriarchy and all of that. So to a large extent, I will not say it's a north, south, east, west divide, but just, populations which have been able to grow, they educate the girl child. They empower their people to become critical thinking individuals. Critical thinking has two meanings. One is that you're able to critique power structures and authority in a very analytical way. The other is to have the skills and competencies to make things happen. So education, which is driven by the spirit of critical thinking, is something that is extremely essential, I think, and at the core looking at what are the malignancies of society, what are the problems that we have at the grassroots level, and really interacting with them. So it can be sanitation, it could be health, it could be education, it could be gender justice, it could be lack of access to basic infrastructure, and really prioritizing your citizens' welfare above vote bank politics, above the actually doing the work versus portraying that you're doing a lot and maybe not doing anything on the ground. Data-backed tracking, capacity building of your stakeholders, citizen-centric governance, involving every stakeholder in the process, and all those principles of governance. Reforms at a regulatory level, like at NITI, we are heading, actually the cabinet secretary is a deregulation exercise. So there was this Jan Vishwas bill that you may have heard about, which is decriminalizing a lot of laws which didn't make sense. Now there's a deregulation exercise over 11 sectors like environment, tax, industries. We are looking at regulations which have very stringent penalties or very things which can curb growth, and we're trying to do away with it and rationalizing it. So there are a lot of expert committees being made. So doing all of that with the correct intent. So I will not treat it as like a political thing or a north-south thing, but more like what it really takes to bring about change.
As you mentioned, during your college days, you used to protest against government policies. You said it, right? So now, from being a protester, now you're working with the government machinery. So obviously, you would have protested because you felt something as unfair, or maybe you would have felt it unfair. So what I'm asking is, now being in government service, do you think everything is going in a fair way? There is also a personal question, because you would have sometime you would have felt this is not a fair way, but the government goes with it, right? So what is your opinion?
I think yes, there were times when I wouldn't say I protested against the government, I just protested for certain cause which I felt required, say, more laws or like more better attention, like that. So it was maybe like that. One thing which has changed when I have entered the government is, so when I did litigation also, it was different than protests, but towards some kind of action towards the solution. Because at one point I realized, yes, there are a class of citizens which don't even identify a problem. If there's some people identify a problem, they don't even raise their voice. If they raise their voice, they're just talking about problems. So I wanted to change from becoming somebody who raised their voices for problems to become part of the solution. That is when I joined public interest litigation. Working in the government has also given me so much of exposure to that bird's eye view. So many things go into taking a decision that has really grounded me to understand that, there are so many interests and priorities that have to be kept in mind where making decisions and implementation. We have budgetary constraints, fiscal sustainability issues, laws, regulations, politics, geopolitics. There is so much that goes on into making a decision. So then you start thinking about solutions. But yes, everything, maybe it feels fair or maybe not, but I have been lucky that even within the government, I am at that department, which the role of that department is to be a watchdog of the government, is to critique or create, point out loopholes in the schemes, projects and policies of all the ministries, to see what can be corrected, where things are going down, to do that evaluation, and then seeing what budget allocation is to do. So my role within the government is, I'm still on the protesting side. None of the ministries really appreciate our work, because they, we point out, okay, this is where your problem is, okay, this has not happened. They're like, oh my God, these guys keep on, so irritating, these guys keep on taking out loopholes. So my role within the government is also core intention, with synergy with that. It's again about finding transparency, it's about finding whether this program is achieving that end. It's about looking, is it targeting the correct beneficiaries? Is it socially, inclusive? All of those things. So that is what my vertical at NITI does. What is the problem and what can we do about it? So I think that change from being to identify, I'm still identifying the problems, but I'm also giving the solutions.
First of all, thank you for your wonderful session.
Thank you.
And you're truly an inspiration person. And the thing I want to ask is that, as you said, Delhi being the capital of our country, has been always hitting the headlines like being a gas chamber, and we have been hearing this news every time since November and December. So, as a common man, I would think, see, this incident has been happening in your backyard, and all these institutions, governments, establishments has been in this Delhi and its adjoining areas. So I would think, if they have been not able to solve some issue in their backyard, how would they solve the issue in other issues that we are facing? So, what is your opinion?
I completely agree with you. The good part about me working in the government is I'm able to question it, hold it accountable, and ask questions, because my first duty is as a citizen of the country. So I never miss my words. I am so pained at the problem of air pollution which is happening in our, in the capital year on year. A lot, but also as a specialist, I also work in environmental sustainability related aspects. There is a lot which is in the hand of the government, but there is a lot which is not, and there is a lot which is in the hand of the citizens. Now let me tell you what is not. When we talk about air pollution in Delhi, 1/3 of the air pollution in Delhi is, I'm quoting this from a very famous report, is created in Delhi itself. The rest is actually comes outside Delhi. NCR is a 1/3 contributor, and the states beyond it is a 1/3 contributor. You hear that stubble burning increases, so therefore it increases, so the stopping the farmers will lead to that. But apparently that is just 5 to 6% of the winter pollution. The rest is dust, construction, the vehicular pollution, industrial sort of discharge, all of that, which remains the same throughout the year. So it's not just that curbing forest burning can cause it. Another thing which is not in our hands is the meteorological conditions that changes. So what happens is Aravalli is on this side and Himalayas on that side, they create a low basin area, which means that when the winds go from top, it prevents, because the winds kind of slow down in the winters. So they get consolidated in that area. And what happens is that cold air remains down, hot air goes on top, and there's like a sandwich approach which happens, which makes all the pollutants at the ground area, and plus there are no winds. So what I'm saying is there are meteorological conditions which are also responsible for this. So we're at a flag from that. What we tried, you may have heard that the Delhi government tried cloud seeding a few days ago. Cloud seeding is when you sprinkle silver iodide or NaCl on the clouds to bring about artificial rain. They tried that. I think IIT Kanpur helped them with that. But the problem was that you need at least 40 or 50% moisture in the clouds for the rains to happen. So all that sprinkling happened, but there were no rains. Maybe just added a little more to the pollution. So what we are saying is that they are addressing the symptom, what I talked about. They are not addressing the problem, which is perhaps a part is the crop burning. So do we need biofertilizers? Do we need more startups to go there and, convert those stubbles into manure that they can use? There are so many people, but they need scale, they need finance. Do you change the emission norms? Do you hold the industries which are there in the peripheries of NCRs, which are polluting all the factories, to get their regulatory acts into go? Now, all of that is what government has to do. Do you tell construction companies to follow the rules? So that is not just at the political level, it's also your law enforcement. If the officers which are enforcing it in the police, in the municipalities will not do their duty, I mean, there is only so much that we at the policy level can make a change. And lastly, the citizens. I am so against firecrackers, but somehow Delhi believes that, yes, we have pollution, so let's create more pollution. So in Diwali and all of that, everybody burst so many crackers, knowing that it's the worst time of the year. So again, the difference, education, critical thinking, and what our constitution talks about, developing scientific temper. If you don't have in your citizens, they will do these things, and some people name it a religious thing. Maybe some of you have heard, oh no, it is our right to burst crackers in Diwali. When Diwali was a sign of Lord Ram coming back to Ayodhya, in that century we didn't have any Chinese firecrackers to burst to invite that. What is this tradition and culture that they are talking about? We had lamps. It's a festival of light. So, you make rangoli, you have lamps, you share gifts, you talk to people. It's about love. But like everything else, it's just a crass show of power driven by uncritical minds in that sense. So I think, yes, there are ad hoc things that they do, that they'll put Grab, BS6 vehicles, commercial vehicles are only allowed, and Grab is a pollution control method. They have 1, 2, 3, 4 stage, and all of that happens. But that's a very short-term measure. If we don't deal with, see, Beijing and China faced worse levels of pollution some time back, but they created solutions to do that because they thought it's important. Maybe till the time we as citizens don't rise up, we don't name the issue, shame the issue, till the time it doesn't become a political issue, till that, like reservations may be, or farmers' protests may be, or women's rights may be, till the time environment and sustainability doesn't become a political issue, there is not much incentive for the government to do, though it should. So I think a large responsibility also lies with the citizens.
You had mentioned here that there is a gap between policy and implementation, and also theory and practice. And you had also mentioned that you are the authority, or you can question the government policies or the ministries who implement the policies. But when we are looking to the society, there is so many policies to empower the society, to empower the weaker section of the society. But when we are looking to the reality, there is no such reflections. Policy reflections or the result of the policies are not much reflected in the society. So what's the reason?
So I was want to ask you that how do you decide that it's being reflected in the society or not? I mean, okay, now I'll come back for you to develop that critical thinking mindset. There is one thing seeing at the micro level that, okay, nothing is happening, government is not doing anything. But did you actually go to the individual dashboards to check what kind of initiatives have been implemented in, say, the past financial year cycles? What kind of target beneficiaries have achieved maybe support in agricultural infrastructure, or funding to set up self-help groups, or projects under MG Narega, or some kind of road building under PM JSY. So the first thing as civil servants or any critical thinking citizen is that you have to look at data, and you have to talk from the perspective of evidence and not the feel factor or anecdotal information. And that, irrespective of where we are, we have to do. So what I'm trying to say is that, yes, a lot is being done, but a lot more has to be done because we have a huge population. So even if we set certain 5-year targets, we keep on have to, like, now all the schemes and projects will come for reappraisal, and because the 16th Finance Commission cycle is going to come, so it will all come back. We will be doing the evaluations. There we will see how much achievement has been made from schemes, but most of the schemes will be reinstituted because there are so many more people who need to be benefited from it. So like the Swachh Bharat mission, yes, this much success has happened, but just the quantum of work is so much. And our scalability is not always, so we need to just do it bit by bit. So every 5 years it's improving, but given how large and diverse our country is, it is bound to take some time. There is also this book called Factfulness by Hans Rosling, who actually talks about, because of the media, social media, our academic background, sometimes we feel that everything is doomed. This world is doomed, everything is doomed. But he writes that actually when you look at data, you see that things have improved. Infant mortality has improved from that benchmark. Climate parameters have improved. Women's education has improved. Health parameters have improved. So that gives you a very realistic kind of view. So I just want you, like, okay, if you think that this scheme has not reached that, you can go on to the dashboard of this scheme, and all the information is given there. How many people have been benefited, how many new houses have been created, or Jal Jeevan Mission, how many new water connections have been given. Everything is available on the dashboard for you to see. So I think look at it from a data perspective.
I didn't fully critique that. I just said that
Yeah,
law
I think I
reflection,
understand.
not complete policies are not completely not implemented. I just said that low reflection in the society. When I look to the reality, or when I heard about it, it's all, sometimes it will be lack of my knowledge. But when I heard from the people who studies in the northern states, or who studies out of our state, from out of the Kerala, or the people who traveled out of the Kerala, they said that there are so many people who didn't got the benefits because of bureaucratic inefficiency. So we also know that there is bureaucratic inefficiency, and we know that there is a problem. But means Some people said that there is bureaucratic. When we are looking to the challenges, there is bureaucratic inefficiency. But this problem is not completely or solving that aspect of the problem.
Yes, like that is exactly your role. Because see, we are on the policymaker side, but you will be on the implementation side. So the inefficiency is largely on the executive arm of the civil services, or the entire machinery which helps enforce it. Therefore, the principles of efficiency, efficacy, integrating technology, automating things, getting experts and consultants on board, making things happen, accountability from the top and other ways around. These governance principles are very important to know, because yes, at the end we can give as much money and we can make the big schemes. If they're not being implemented on ground, then there is not much use. But that is your responsibility in the future. We will allocate the money, give you the program, you have to execute it well.
Hi ma'am.
Hello.
My question is that as we are civil servant aspirants, so in part of policy making, we are having some discrepant part. So there are so many cases that have been read in newspaper that so many person like some civil servants are may came to the problem of corruption. So do you have experience where you have seen corrupted officers misuse this power, which ultimately affect the outcome of welfare schemes? If yes, have you ever thought of having an accountability mechanism where the power of civil servants, who are the final word in initiating a policy, should be restricted?
Okay, so in my nature of my role, we deal at a very macro level. So we get all the projects and schemes of, hundreds, thousands or lakhs of crores which we have to deal with. So because I work at that macro level, what happens at an individual scheme implementation level in, say, like a district, that kind of information doesn't reach us. But yes, in our analysis, we are able to point out that so much money was given for this task, but it has not achieved its goals. What are the reasons it has not achieved its goals? Can any of it be attributed to some kind of leakage, some kind of pilferage? And wherever we feel that those gaps are there in the schemes, we try to put in accountability checks in the scheme design itself to do that. Then we have something called the theory of change, the logic model. What that means is, okay, we've made the project design using all this, then you implement it. But not only do a post-implementation evaluation, but to do a mid-term evaluation to see whether it's reaching its goals. If not, you get the feedback of all the stakeholders over there and you feed back that into the project design stage to change, and then you re-implement it, and then there is a post-implementation evaluation. The checks and balances are, yes, the appraisals that we do before implementation, the monitoring, the constant monitoring that is being done throughout by the ministry as well as the DMEU, and finally the evaluation reports which come out at the end, including the CAG audit reports. They go to the grassroots level and they find out those problems that are faced because they do these focused group discussions, or they do like a survey, or they'll actually go to the ground to see. So we get those reports. So we get some insights that, okay, in these areas there are loopholes where corruption can happen. What can be the solution? Can we give some GovTech? Is it a regulatory governance problem? Is it a technological problem? Can we do some kind of direct beneficiary transfer or some kind of technology interface which can make things more transparent? So that is where at the policy level we, plug the loopholes. But exactly which civil servant has done, that micro level we don't do at the central government level.
My question is related to Niti Aayog. So, being a think tank, data remains your main fodder. So, what is the data collection process of Niti Aayog and how scientific it is?
So, a lot of it comes from our nodal ministries. So, we create dashboards, indices, where the states are able to put up their own data in terms of, SDG, how they are performing, or the investment friendly charter, ease of doing business, so on and so forth. The data that we use in our decision making comes from the ministry itself, on their dashboards. So for example, if I get a project or scheme in agriculture, I'll go on to the agricultural ministry scheme dashboard. There they will tell us how much money was allocated, how much infrastructure has been created, how many farmers have been benefited, how much of fertilizer inputs, etc. was given under different schemes. So for each of the schemes, we have that, and it's the ministry's responsibility to do that. Niti Aayog itself has 2-3 of its own projects for which they do their data collection. It can be surveys, it can be through focused group discussions. There are different collection methodologies. Usually one uses the mixed methods approach. For example, in monitoring and evaluation, where you use a mix of qualitative and quantitative research methodologies to get input. So it can be by interviewing the beneficiaries, or it can be by actually gaining secondary data from district level officers, or by going and actually checking it on ground. But that's only for the few core initiatives that we ourselves drive. For all the other sectors, every other ministry has their own dashboard. Like sports, Khelo India dashboard will be there, how many stadiums have been made, geotagging is being done, so we know exactly what is the current construction state of that stadium in this state. So I can actually go and see, okay, this has just been constructed, this is already done, why are they asking for more money, so on and so forth. So it's ministry driven mostly.
The root cause of social inequality comes from whether it is coming from the implementation deficit, or is there an issue in the policy design also, because the issues like intersectionality and also there may be not enough data, the issue of data collection, and is Niti Aayog facing an issue in the policy design, and are you collaborating with other international agencies or like World Bank in terms of improving our policy design? So my question is that the issue of implementation only, or is it a issue from the policy design itself?
So I think we get to know that when the evaluations happen, is that are we suggesting something in the policy design which is not practical on ground but looks good on paper. So to that extent, yes, sometimes we do face issues in data. For example, I was writing a sectoral report on the tourism sector, and I realized that we do not have state level tourism statistics. So one of my main recommendations was at least do a mapping exercise to get state level tourism data, because we were making roadmaps for the tourism sector of independent states. Now I cannot make recommendations state specific if I don't have state level data. So that was my main question. But then I found some reports which had some analysis state-wise, some points which we used in making our final thing. So yes, there are some sectors in which data does not exist, and we are on the forefront of telling them that please do data collection on that end. And yes, in many projects at the central government, but more at the state government projects, we take financial loans as well as knowledge capacity building and knowledge transfer help from the World Bank, from the Asian Development Bank, JICA, Japan, New Development Bank. So yes, all of them do come on board. What we do in our vertical is we don't prefer taking loans because the interest rates are very high. So usually to the states we recommend that instead you take loans from our internal banks because the interest rates are low. But if you're taking help from them, make sure that in your contract you add that their people are going to come and do capacity building. They will be telling us the best international practices, how to implement that. They will be giving us the entire roadmap how to do it. So you just don't give money, you give your knowledge also. So that is something we finance plus element is what we call it. So yes, that happens.
Hello ma'am. First of all, thank you for a very valuable session. So I would like to thank you from like different perspective. Personally, I have been always interested in these kind of analytical stuffs, like analyze some problems and come to the solution. So I mean, personally, my plan B is like that only, strategy consultant or something like that field. And the major takeaway from this session for me as a person was that even if we are not getting, I mean, God forbid, if we are not getting into civil services, then also we have so many arenas to meaningfully contribute to the society. And in the highest level, I mean, if we are getting into an assistant collector or, I mean, like the initial postings, then also we have some limitations. But if we are working in the highest positions, I mean, like what do we say, centralized, not centralized planning, but the top of the planning, then we have so many opportunities. And next one was from the exam point of view. Whenever we talk about governance, all these kind of topics, our teachers and mentors always say, we have to understand what happens inside. Then only we will be able to come up with problems, because these days UPSC always ask the questions in an analytical format. Like we have to see, we have to look for what is not visible to the outside. So we have to analyze the problems and suggest solutions. And if we know what happens inside properly, like if you had told that we get data from every ministry and we sit around a table and discuss, so we can just pinpoint the problems. Okay, data collection, there may be problems, and the coordination between the ministries, there may be problems. And when we talk about Niti Aayog, personally I feel that if the chief ministers of different states are coming together for a meeting, that itself can solve many problems, because ultimately we are all people, right? So these kind of more insights, like how to approach a problem even in the personal life or in the exam point of exam perspective, this helped us a lot, I feel. And thirdly, again coming to the similar to the first point, that we have, I mean, these points, like how to approach a problem and solve the problem, will help us not only in the civil services but as the leaders in other fields also. So by that manner, I think we all can have like these lessons cherishing for our life throughout. Because some specific things I have encountered in my graduation level, that we have to analyze based on data, not from some gut feeling or something like that. I mean, gut feeling matters, but still that also should be based on data. These factors and these lessons will be very valuable for us throughout our life, I feel. And thanks a lot for that. And as Ashmil said, welcome again. Anytime, I mean, like, visit us more and interact with us more. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, there is no dearth of opportunities, you know. You have the government roles, you have PMU roles, think tank roles, academia, international NGOs, international multilateral development banks. So policy, sectoral knowledge will never go waste anywhere. All your education here, especially your specialization, you'll get so many opportunities. And if I spoke more from the policy perspective, but I have many more implementation problems that I see. Why we send back projects that come from the states, what is wrong with their proposal, what do we feel is wrong in the fund disbursement and all of that. But that's a very technical session, maybe for some other time, talking to all of you, and I hope I was able to add some value to your student life.